Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, Federalist Read Along. We are today reading Federalist numero 28. And I should apologize. Cookie, hi, thank you for coming. I do want to apologize. I have not actually put out a video in about a week as I fix my focus here. I've been a little bit under the weather, so I do apologize for that inconvenience. Though it was mostly an inconvenience for me, I assure you. There we go. A little bit clearer for you there. We are going to read through Federalist number 28 today, so thank you for coming. I am just fixing up a few tidy things over here. I'm a lot better. It's one of those things. Haven't been sick in 2 years, so a little bit of sickness seems to hamper me. That's fine. For anyone who's new here, now that we've done our bantering, I have one more banter. I'm getting a haircut tomorrow. Don't worry. I know how it looks. For anyone who's new here, what we're going to do is read through the Federalist paper, specifically today, Federalist number 28 by Alexander Hamilton. We will go line by line through the 18th century language to see if we can't learn a little bit something about what Hamilton was arguing for the United States Constitution. So let's bounce right over to the big screen without further ado. Federalist number 28, the same subject continued, the idea of restraining the legislative authority in regard to the common defense considered. Now, this is the third time that he is talking about this particular subject. In the last two, Hamilton has pretty strongly been arguing over the last several papers, not only the need for a standing army, but the need for the federal government to have the power to raise and make any laws necessary to use that standing army, both abroad and domestically. And as the title here suggests, he is really standing up for the idea that the states should not have any ability to control the army whatsoever. So let's continue. This one is for the Independent Journal. He bounces between the New York Packet and Independent Journal. December 26th, last week's video was on Christmas Day. This is the day after Christmas. Hamilton is not taking time for his family. With that, to the people of the state of New York, as always, these are written to the people of the state of New York. And let's get into it. That there may happen cases in which the national government may be necessitated to resort to force cannot be denied. So he's starting right off the bat by saying sometimes the national government is going to have to use an army. Great. He says it cannot be denied, and well, that seems to be true. Is this already a pretty long sentence here? Okay, unless I missed a period. Our own experience hath, that's how much 18th century language I read, where I see the word has and say hath. Anyway, our own experience has corroborated the lessons taught by the examples of other nations. That emergencies of this sort will sometimes arise in all societies, however constituted. That seditions and insurrections are, unhappily, maladies as inseparable from the body politic as tumors and eruptions from the natural body. That the idea of governing at all times by the simple force of law, which we have been told is the only admissible principle of republican government, has no place but in the reveries of those political doctors whose sagacy disdains the admonitions of experimental instruction. As always, using loud, big, flowery language. Let's go back one bit at a time and break it down further. It's a pretty long sentence. So, our own experience has taught us the lessons by the examples of other nations. So not only in the American Revolution, but looking at other countries, we've seen that sometimes you got to come to war. That emergencies of this sort will arise in all societies, however constituted. So no matter what government you have, you will eventually need to use an army. Seditions and insurrections are unhappily maladies that spring forth. So sometimes it's a revolt of the people from within. Oftentimes, it seems that Hamilton is referencing. That the idea of governing at all times by simple force of law, which we have been told is the only admissible principle of republican government, so the idea that people will just obey the laws is garbage. Sometimes people will not obey the laws. Continuing. So such emergencies at any time happen under the national government, there can be no remedy but force. So if the national government's in charge, then that's the one that will have to use the army. The means to be employed must be proportional to the extent of the mischief. So the amount of force that the army uses to defend whatever the national government needs to defend, the army needs to be at least as big as the problem it is stopping, whether it's another army or a rebellion from within, which seems to be what he's really focusing on right now. If it should be a slight commotion in a small part of a state, the militia of the residue would be adequate to its suppression. And the national presumption is that they would be ready to do their duty. So if there's a little bit of a rebellion in one part of the state, then the state should be able to handle that. The militia today would probably reference that the police should be able to take care of it, but what they say here is the militia should be adequate to suppress it, and the national government would assume they'll take care of it themselves. An insurrection, whatever may be its immediate cause, eventually endangers all government. So even if it's a small problem in one of the states, eventually it could lead to danger for the national government. Regard to the public peace, if not to the rights of the Union, would engage the citizens to whom the contagion hath not communicated itself to oppose the insurgents. Let me read this one a little bit better. Regard to the public peace, if not to the rights of the Union, would engage the citizen to whom the contagion had not communicated itself to oppose the insurgents, and if the general government should be found in practice conducive to the prosperity and felicity of the people, it were irrational to believe that they would be declined to its support. Excuse me. Oh, going live. Told you. Still there a little bit. Excuse me. So both peace to the people in general and the preservation of the Union, if there is a rebellion and insurgency, it should be put down. If the general government be found in practice conducive to the prosperity, so if the government is doing a good job, which you'd hope it would be, then there really be no reason for any insurrection of that nature. And that type of rebellion should be pretty easily suppressed because it will be a small minority of the people who are actually following it. If, on the contrary, the insurrection should pervade a whole state or a principal part of it, the employment of a different kind of force might become unavoidable. So if an entire state is rebelling against the against the national government. Again, with this paper, Hamilton is just kind of assuming that the national government has been agreed to in this particular scenario. And he is kind of predicting the Civil War to a degree. If a whole state should rebel against the Union, you might need a different kind of force than just what he calls the militia, what today we would call the police. It appears that Massachusetts found it necessary to raise troops for repressing the disorders within that state. That Pennsylvania, from the mere apprehension of commotions among a part of her citizens, has thought it proper to have recourse to the same measure. So Massachusetts, he's referencing Shays' Rebellion here, which was put down. In Pennsylvania, which Hamilton's referenced several times recently in other Federalist papers in regard to its the Pennsylvania Constitution prohibits a standing army in time of peace, but he's noting here that they've called in the militia on several occasions, even though it was technically peacetime, because although nothing really broke out, but just from the mere apprehension that something might happen. Excuse me. Suppose the state of New York had been inclined to reestablish her lost jurisdiction over the inhabitants of Vermont. Could she have hoped for success in such an enterprise from the efforts of the militia alone? So, Vermont famously was technically claimed by New York, technically claimed by New Hampshire, not so technically claimed by Massachusetts and Connecticut, kind of claimed by Canada in a degree. At this point, Vermont was still a territory. Technically, Vermont had declared itself an independent nation in hopes it would become a state. New York still had claims over it, and the reason Vermont hadn't become a state is because both New Hampshire and New York were still saying it was theirs, and people owned land from both states and they needed to be repaid for the land they had, yada, yada, yada. Either way, he is writing to the people of New York and trying to pull at their heartstrings and say, hey, do you want Vermont back? You think you'll be able to do that with just the militia? No, you might need the federal government to step in and help you out with that. Would she not have been compelled to raise and maintain a more regular force for the execution of her design? So not just a militia, but an actual New York army? If it must then be admitted that the necessity of recurring to a force different from the militia in cases of this extraordinary nature is applicable to the state governments themselves, why should the possibility that the national government might be under a like necessity in similar extremities be made an objection to its existence? So Hamilton's really kind of stretching things here. At a time where most people in New York agree with the Anti-Federalists, who are saying we don't need a standing army, we have the militia, he's saying, what if the militia wasn't enough to retake rebellious Vermont and you needed to raise an actual army? It's interesting because that army would be raised of New Yorkers who were all probably serving in the militia. Excuse me one second. Just getting over something. Getting a little choked up. So it's kind of a stretch to say New York would need to raise an army and then assuming that he's right with that question. He doesn't even say it. He asks. And then he says, well, if you agree with the question I just asked as truth, then, excuse me, why would the national government be any different than the federal government? Again, assuming we've already ratified the national government. More questions. He loves asking himself questions. It is not surprising that men who declare an attachment to the Union in the abstract should urge as an objection to the proposed Constitution what applies with tenfold weight to the plan for which they contend, and what, as far as it has any foundation in truth, is an inevitable consequence of civil society upon an enlarged scale. I forgot I was asking a question there. So it's talking about the Anti-Federalists who say why they say that they want the Union, but they don't like the Constitution because the Constitution has a standing army. But based on the questions I just asked rhetorically, you obviously agree with me because I'm Alexander Hamilton. Why would these people think it's okay to have a standing army within the state? He's essentially putting words in their mouth through question form, which is a shady way to go about it, to say the least. I'm trying to think of an example of how he's saying, well, if you wanted to take Vermont, wouldn't you need more than a militia? Well, if you need more than a militia, why shouldn't the national government have a militia? Well, if you want the Union, why wouldn't you agree that the national government should have a union, or should have an army? I don't know. I've lost the plot a little bit on this analogy, but it's very peculiar. Excuse me. Who would not prefer that possibility to the unceasing agitations and frequent revolutions which are the continual scourge of petty republics? Again, asking a question, who would not prefer the possibility of unceasing... Okay, so why would you want there to be always little insurrections popping up? And he calls them petty republics because he's saying one of the arguments of the Anti-Federalists is the national government is too big. What he's implying here is that the state governments would be just simply too small. And they would always be fighting insurrections from within, when you could have a federal government who could just step in and make sure the people at large never get what they want. Anyway, continuing. Let us pursue this examination in another light. So he's saying, I'm going to repeat what I just said, but in a totally different way. Great. More questions. Loves asking questions. Suppose, in lieu of one general system, 2 or 3 or even 4 confederacies were to be formed. Would not the same difficulty oppose itself to the operations of either of these confederacies? Shouldn't he say any of these confederacies because it's multiple? Anyway, so instead of one national government, we have 2 or 3. Excuse me. I apologize. I knew it was a risk coming on today. Might have to do 28 again at next year. Anyway, what he's saying in this statement, if it wasn't one national government, if there were 2 or 3 different governments that came together amongst the states, wouldn't we have the same problem? Would not each of them be exposed to the same casualties? And when these happened, be obliged to have recourse to the same expedients from upholding its authority, which are objected to in a government for all the states? These questions are a little tough to translate. It's easier when he's just saying it outright. But since he's asking, it's kind of, I have to decode it backwards. Would not each of these be exposed to the same thing, have the same recourse and experience? So, objected to in a government of all the states. So, What he's saying here is, if there instead of one national government, there was like a New England government and a Confederacy of the South and a Confederacy of the Mid-Atlantic, wouldn't you have the same arguments against those that you have against the federal government? I will repeat, we haven't come across this in a while. In the first like 6 or 7, 8 Federalist papers, Hamilton was very often kind of accusing the Anti-Federalists of wanting to have separate confederacies, and you very rarely heard anyone say that. And now he's defaulted back to that old kind of line where he's putting words in their mouth. If these Anti-Federalists want these separate governments, why don't they have the same objections to these separate confederacies as one national government? To which most Anti-Federalists would say, we don't want that in the first place. No thanks, man. Continuing. Would the militia in this supposition be more ready or more able to support the federal authority than in the case of a general union? So would the militia be happier with these separate confederacies than one national government? Again, no one's arguing for that, so who cares? Long sentence here. All candid and intelligent men must, upon due consideration, acknowledge that the principle of the objection is equally applicable to either of the two cases, and that whether we have one government for all the states, or different governments for different parcels of them, or even if there should be an entire separation of the states, there might sometimes be a necessity to make a use of force constituted differently from the militia to preserve the peace of the community and to maintain the just authority of the laws against those violent invasions of which amount to insurrections and rebellions. Yeah, maybe this wasn't a good idea. I thought I was good. I'm sorry. Here, Hamilton is saying, in any situation, one national government, a few separate confederacies, 13 separate states, separate nations, eventually, we're going to have to go and jump from the militia to an army anyway. Which, maybe, but that would generally be made up of the militia if it were the separate states. We're under a different version of the government. It's a very peculiar, again, argument that he's going to, as usual. Independent of all other reasonings upon the subject, it is a full answer to those who require a more peremptory provision against military establishments in times of peace to say that the whole power of the proposed government is to be in the hands of the representatives of the people. So, in times of peace, the army has to be in the hands of some government, but is a full answer to those who require a more peremptory provision. Okay. So people who, the Anti-Federalists who don't want any peacetime standing army, the whole power of the proposed government, it's a weird sentence, is a full answer to those who require more peremptory provision against... Excuse me. I'm sorry, I keep coughing at you guys. It's been a week since I made a video. I really didn't want to leave you hanging too long. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble with the sentence. It is a full answer to those who require a more peremptory provision against times of peace to say the whole power of the proposed government be in the hands of the representatives of the people. Oh, so either way, no matter whether or not there is a provision permitting or outlawing a standing army in times of peace, it's a Republican government, so the representatives of the people are in charge anyway. This is the essential, and after all, only efficacious security for the rights and privileges of the people, which is attainable in a civil society. So whatever we decide here doesn't matter anyway, because the people are in charge. The representatives of the people are in charge. Some of the people at the time. If the representatives of the people betray their constituents, there is then no resource left but in the exertion of that original right of self-defense, which is paramount to all positive forms of government, and which again, the usurpations of the national rulers may be exerted with infinitely better prospect of success than against those of the rulers of an individual state. Assertion of the right of self-defense. if the representatives of the people betray their constituents, there is no resource left but in the exertion of that original right of self-defense, which is paramount to all positive forms of government, and which against the usurpations of national rulers may be considered with infinitely better prospect of success. So what he's saying here is if the national government becomes tyrannical, then the states should be able to, it'll be easier to get rid of national rulers who are tyrannical than state rulers who are tyrannical. So it doesn't make sense because his whole argument of a national army is to make sure that the states can't come at the national government. In a single state, if the persons entrusted with the supreme power become usurpers, the different parcels, subdivisions, or districts of which it consists have no distinct government in each, can take no regular measures for defense. So, counties and towns cannot defend themselves from the state governments, ignoring, of course, the militia, and that most states had posse comitatus rules, essentially calling out the posse. The sheriff could call the militia out to defend the town and county, and then the militiamen would have to decide if they choose the state or the county, and if the state really is tyrannical, then they would probably choose their town or county against the state. The citizens must rush tumultuously to arms, without concert, without system, without recourse, except in their courage and despair. Except most states had comitatus rules, and their militias were well-trained, well-regulated militias. Actually, one of the Anti-Federalists, I'm forgetting which one, actually one of the arguments was, why does it say the national government can call in the state militias on its behalf, but there's no posse comitatus rule for the people or the sheriff to call it in on their behalf? The usurpers, clothed with the forms of legal authority, can too often crush the opposition in embryo. So because the state governments have the legal authority they can stop rebellions from within the states, but he was just arguing that you need the national government to help the states crush rebellions. And now he's saying that the states can do it no problem, barely an inconvenience. The smaller the extent of the territory, the more difficult it will be for the people to form a regular or systematic plan of opposition, and the more easy it will be to defeat their early efforts. So, if it's just the state government, the people will have no problem getting a rebellion off the ground. Intelligence can be more speedily obtained. Excuse me. I'm sorry, guys. Intelligence can be more speedily obtained of their preparations and movements, and the military force in the possession of the usurpers can be more rapidly directed against the part where the opposition has become. Same thing. The state can just shut down a rebellion real quick. Not a problem at all. In this situation, there must be a peculiar coincidence of circumstances to ensure success to the popular resistance. Okay. Again, like literally that whole paragraph was arguing against himself in the earlier paragraph. Hamilton keeps saying the states can't take care of themselves. The states can't stop a rebellion. There's no way the states can ever stop a rebellion. Oh, wait. If they become tyrannical and the people are in the right, they could just... Oh, yeah, then the states can easily stop a rebellion without even trying before it gets started. Okay, cool. The obstacles to usurpation and the facilities of resistance increase with the increased extent of the state, provided the citizens understand their rights and are disposed to defend them. So, the bigger a state or nation, the easier it is for the people to defend their rights, as long as they understand them and they have the courage to defend them. The natural strength of the people in a large community, in proportion to the artificial strength of the government, is greater than in a small, and of course more competent to a struggle with the attempts of the people, of the government to establish a tyranny. So, people have no problem throwing off this government. But in a confederacy of the people, without exaggeration, may be said to be entirely the masters of their own fate. So, in a confederacy, the people are masters of their own fate. But he doesn't like confederacies. He likes a national government. The power being almost always the rival of power, the general government will at all times stand ready to check the usurpations of the state governments, and these will have the same disposition towards the general government. So the federal government will check the states will check the federal. That's a common argument in the Federalist Papers. The people, by throwing themselves into either scale, will infallibly make it preponderate. So they'll choose sides based on what's happening to balance it out. If their rights are invaded by either, they can make use of the other as an instrument of redress. So if the federal government is being oppressive, they can use the states to fix it. If the state government is being oppressive, they can use the federal government to fix it. How wise will it be in them, by cherishing the union, to preserve to themselves an advantage which can never be too highly prized! Exclamation point. Very rare exclamation point in the Federalist Papers. How smart are the American people to understand that the Constitution gives them the ability to protect themselves from both the state and the federal government by pitting one against the other, never considering what happens when they work together. It may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. So, the states, what he's saying here is the states will work to protect the people from the national government. It shouldn't even come to the people revolting against the states. The states will be helping to make sure the national government does not get too tyrannical. Projects of usurpation cannot be masked under pretenses so likely to escape the penetration of select bodies of men as of the people at large. So the people will always be paying attention and making sure the government doesn't get carried away. The legislatures will have a better means of information. Oh, I'm sorry, I said this backwards. This last sentence says, the state governments are select bodies. They are very particular representatives. They will pay attention and make sure things don't get out of hand. They have a better means of information. Now, this is obviously before the digital age. Heck, this is before the the telegraph age. So information traveled slowly. So to actually be on hand, be a representative, was important at the time because you could hear what was being discussed. It was very important to choose your representatives at the time and trust them. Today we pretty quickly jump on our politicians, and rightfully so in many cases, because we hear what they're saying right away and we know what's going on around them in the room. But it took you months to find out the conversations that were being had. If you were from North Carolina and you were representing North Carolina in the government and someone from New Hampshire came with information, it would be a long time before the people in North Carolina even heard what you heard, let alone had any thoughts on the decisions that were being made. Anyway, not to digress. They can discover the danger at a distance, and possessing all the organs of civil power and the confidence of the people, they can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition in which they can combine all the resources of the community. So they'll see things going wrong before they go wrong, and they'll be able to work together on behalf of the people because they have the trust of the people to make sure things are carried out appropriately in all scenarios. They can readily communicate with each other in different states and unite the common forces for the protection of their common liberty. So if the federal government is getting carried away, getting a little treasonous, the representatives will let their states know. And vice versa. If one of the states getting carried away, the federal government will let the other states know. The great extent of the country is a further security. So the fact that the country is so big makes it more secure. We have already experienced its utility against the attacks of a foreign power. We already threw off the government working together. We were able, because the nation was so big, Britain couldn't capture it. I just read that sentence. And it would have been precisely the same effect against the enterprises of ambitious rulers in the National Council. So if in the federal government we have someone trying to take over as a despot in any fashion, well, It's going to be very hard for them to take over all of the states. I'm sure 80 years later, the South would disagree with that discussion, but that's a different conversation for a different channel. If the federal army should be able to quell the resistance of one state, the distant states would have in their power to make head with fresh forces. So, if the national government is trying to stop a rebellion of a state and it's not doing so well, the other states can come help. The advantages obtained in one place must be abandoned to subdue the opposition in others. And the moment the part which had been reduced to submission was left to itself, its efforts would be renewed and the resistance revived. So, one state's rebelling, you got to move your army over there, then another state can rebel, you got to move your army over there. You're never going to get your army everywhere. It's just never going to happen. Apparently. Yellow, I do see your question. We're just finishing up, so I will get to it in just one second. We should recollect that the extent of the military force must at all events be regulated by the resources of the country. So you can only have an army to the degree that you can feed and supply an army. For a long time to come, it will not be possible to maintain a large army. And as the means of doing this increase, the population and natural strength of the community will proportionally increase. Got a cat creaking open a door. Sorry about that. So he's saying the United States at this time when the Constitution is being ratified, they actually can't really support a big army. Like, they did get through the Revolutionary War, but it was very trying. And they had to commandeer a good amount of stuff to make that happen. But as the country grows, it'll be easier and easier. Oh, another question. When will the time arrive that the federal government can raise and maintain an army capable of erecting a despotism over the great body of the people of an immense empire, who are in a situation, through the medium of their state governments, to take measures for their own defense with all the celerity, regularity, and system of independent nations? So, how will we possibly get enough people and enough arms ever to suppress the government? I mean, it's weird because Hamilton's usually a real forward thinker. They knew industrialization was underway. It's surprising he couldn't really picture like such powerful weapons as we might have nowadays. The apprehension may be considered as a disease for which there can be found no cure in the resources of argument and reasoning. So, if you think that that could ever happen, that they could ever make a big enough army to suppress the entirety of the United States, your brain is diseased and we can't cure you. You will never be able to reason. Cool, man. Publius. So, with that, I will get to your question in just a moment. Yellow. You know what, I'm going to take one more sip. Still getting over something. All choked up. Bring myself up. Am I blurry? I am. You know what? I'll unblur myself for this little end here. It happens when we're going live and I'm talking in the little box for too long. Okay. So just to go over that last little discussion we had, Hamilton comes in talking about the federal government, talking more about armies. He doesn't really talk about Congress' ability to raise an army. He, again, talks down to people. He does that circular logic where he asks a bunch of questions and in doing so puts words in the mouths of anti-federalists that they never said. Like, they never said that they wanted separate confederacies. The idea was floated by some people, but it wasn't really spoken of tremendously. Not by the major anti-federalists I've read anyway, or at least read recently anyway. He goes on to discuss that, he puts the idea in people's mouths that, well, if New York needs to take back over Vermont, they're going to have to raise an army. They can't do that with their militia. It's like, well, no, New York primarily was arguing against the standing army at the time. You can't just make that assumption. Either way, he goes on to say that the state governments, the Constitution will protect the people from usurpation. Actually, first he repeats his old stomping ground that, what if the people want to come and get it? What if there's a revolt? Well, the federal government can put down a revolt better than the state governments. He then says it'll be easier to stop tyrannical governments under the Constitution system. He does make the one argument that you have the state governments fighting against the federal government, and the federal government fighting against the state governments to make sure neither of them become tyrannical, which is a fair idea. But he also goes into the idea that the state governments, it'll be a lot harder for tyranny. It would be easier for tyranny to erupt in the state governments than the national government. The people will be able to protect themselves better from the national government than the state governments, because the state governments can just easily suppress any resistance, which contradicts his long-standing argument that the states can't suppress resistance, and that's why you need the federal government to help the states prevent insurrection. He really just goes back. It's a terrible, terrible hypocrisy in his argument. That being said, was the bicameral legislature idea from Hamilton or Madison? Excuse me. I'm sorry. Yellow, you came in late. I'm getting over something. That's why I haven't had any videos in a few days. Anyone who's watched this whole time, I keep repeating myself. I haven't had videos in a few days. I've been a little under the weather. So bicameral legislature, I mean, I guess in America we technically get it from Britain, although you could really make the argument it comes from ancient Rome. But our bicameral, meaning two houses, comes primarily from Great Britain. We essentially took their model. The chief executive, we have a president, they have a king. They have the House of Lords and House of Commons, and we have the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. So that idea really came from them. Although I will say there is an interesting argument that I believe it was Cato. I think it was Cato was the Anti-Federalist that made it, saying how, well, what they have in England is the House of Lords. They have an actual aristocracy. Their elite members of society are officially elite, and they cannot serve in the House of Lords. And the House of Lords is common people. They are not elite, and they cannot serve in the House of Lords. So you have the separation represented in government of the elite and the people, which in the United States we don't have. Any person could be a senator, any person could be a representative. So kind of what's the point of a bicameral legislature? But while I think what you're really referencing here is with the Great Compromise. It's also known as the Connecticut Compromise. Mostly Roger Sherman gets credit, but Oliver Wolcott, is it Wolcott or Ellsworth? One of the Olivers from Connecticut. I think Oliver Wolcott also helped come up with the plan. And William Henry Johnson, all the guys from Connecticut stepped in as kind of a middling-sized state and helped determine, hey, why don't we just do equal state representation in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and proportional representation in the House of Representatives. What's interesting about proportional representation is there was a gigantic discussion about how do you decide proportion. You know, obviously nowadays we look back at the 3/5 clause as a blemish on our history, choosing all other persons, aka slaves, as 1/3 of a person. First of all, you have anti-federalists. Cato argues at one point, well, if slaves were 1/3 of a person, why are we counting women as a whole person? And children, to be fair. Why are they whole persons if they can't vote either? They're not really citizens if they can't vote. Not a great argument. I'm laughing because history is terrible. And it's funny. But as for what the North was arguing was, well, you're telling me slaves are your property. So why are you counting your one type of property when it comes to representation in the United States government? Why can't my house or all this land I'm owning or speculating on, why doesn't that count as property? That's property. So shouldn't we get more representation because we have more property? To which a state like North Carolina or Georgia would be like, oh no, and Virginia would be like, we have a lot of property back at that point in time. I've digressed a little bit. I apologize. But to answer your question in brief, the idea of the bicameral legislature really comes from the British model. As for Hamilton and Madison, there was one more thing I was thinking while we were having this discussion, and it was when Hamilton was talking about people being able to stop usurpations. And usurpation is a word for taking over and becoming tyrannical, essentially. He was saying that the states will fight against the federal government against the states to make sure that people are protected from tyranny in any fashion. But what's interesting is Madison's number 10, Federalist number 10. It's one of the most famous ones. It's tyranny of the majority, where, you want to protect the minority from tyranny of the majority. And that's always been presented to me as, yes, we want to make sure we're not suppressing anyone in the minority. Because the majority agrees, and yeah, definitely we don't want to suppress people. But what Madison really argues in that particular paper is, well, we're not going to let the majority of the people rise up and make us do something crazy, like, I don't know, redistribute the wealth or something like that. He's essentially saying, don't worry, elites. We, as the elite minority, will never let the majority of the people have a real say in our government. And it's a fascinating way to look at that particular paper, which for 20 years I looked at totally differently until we were doing the read along. And it dawned on me a few months back while we were live on camera. If you want to go back and watch number 10, maybe I'll do that later tonight, to see when I realized, oh wait, this is not necessarily great for everyone. But Yellow, great question. Thank you so much. And that essentially does it tonight. I would love to stay in chat, but as I said, I'm dying a little bit right now. I can't really breathe. I am going to continue videos. I apologize we didn't do trivia last week. That's when I got sick. That's how long I've been kind of out of it. So we will be doing trivia on Thursday. We'll be back to that. This weekend is a little questionable. I am leaving town, but I hope to be doing some more live stuff in the following weeks. So thank you so much for watching. You are the best. I am your humble and obedient servant, and I'll be back this week. I'm not lying like I did last week, unless I get sick again, maybe. I am lying, maybe, but probably not. Thursday, I will see you there for trivia.